name's David Henderson, and I'm going to talk to you about composing for the bass section today. When you're thinking about composing drum scores for the bass section, there's three key elements that you need to bear in mind. The first element is the rhythmic content of your score. The second element is the voicing of that rhythmic content, or splitting over the different drums you have available. And the third element is the visual element, which is the flourishing, the visuals that are added to the performance. So we'll start by talking about the rhythm. When you're thinking about composing the rhythm for the bass section, so that's the tenor drums and the bass drum, or if more than one bass drum, then the group of bass drums, you want to be thinking about being tasteful and not overpowering what's going on in the snare section or the melody section within the pipes. Make sure that you're only bringing out the points that lend themselves to be brought out within the bass section. Try not to be afraid of playing time at certain parts or having space. That's also relative to being tasteful with the music. Make sure that you're not trying to hit every single note that you hear in the snare line or voice every single note when it comes to voicing the whole thing. Try and, again, leave some space and be tasteful again with the music. Try and be progressive with your scoring as well. Make sure that you don't give everything away in the first bar or first part. Try and start with some time or ease your way into the performance. And as you go, gradually introduce more complex rhythms and more complex voicing throughout the performance. Try to identify the rhythmic hooks that you hear coming across in the snare line. A lot of the time there'll be phrases or sections that are repeated through a tune on the snare. And you want to try and make sure you're bringing those sections out within the bass section. And it can be quite nice to hear different permutations of that same phrase being played differently on the bass section between the tenor drums and the bass drum. Try to have the unison for the snare score to hand or in mind, or with your recording that you're working to when you're writing your rhythm. A lot of the time when snare drummers put unison into their music, and that's when you hear the core drummers, which is everybody apart from the leading drummer, playing different sections of a piece of music. That can often give a different feel to a tune, or it can bring out different accents at different points that maybe didn't come out when you only hear it being played by one drummer. So it's important to have that to hand so that you can hear exactly how it's going to come across when the full core plays that piece of music. Try to make sure that you are enhancing the dynamics and using the same dynamics that you hear being played within the snare line. If you hear crescendo, so going from quiet to loud at certain points, make sure that's reflected within your bass and tenor score at the same point as well, so that the whole thing comes across as one unit. And that works with anything that's to do with dynamics. So if there's loud accents being played in the snare line, reflect that within the bass and tenor line, or soft sections as well. Make sure that's reflected too. Before sending your music round the drummers, once you're happy with what you've written, it's very important to get a fresh listen to what you've written. Now, this sometimes is not commonly done, but I think it works really well if you have someone else listening to what you've written. Now, that can obviously help with if there's sections where you have maybe thought about something different that works there than the next person. They can give you a different example and a different take on what you've written. It's also important to make sure that the person who's composed the snare score is happy with what you've done in the bass section score. They're going to hear certain things they want to come out from your score. When they've written the snare score, they're going to have that in mind. So make sure that it's all coming out as they would like to hear it as well, and everybody's happy with the full music. So we'll move on to the voicing aspect now. As I said before, this is when you play what we call splits within a piece of music. And what we mean by that is the notes split across the different drums that are going to play each individual section. So the first thing you need to do here is identify the number of players or the number of drums that you're going to have available to you. So most of the time, there's not going to be more than, say, 7 notes available on the tenor drum. There's 9 main notes we use on the bagpipe scale, but the 8th and 9th note, the 8th note being the low A, is going to sit on the bass drum, and the low G, which is below that bass drum, would only be used if you have a second bass drum to play that. You wouldn't have that on a tenor drum. So the 7 notes that you use on the tenor drum, going from the high A, which would be the highest note, is the high A, the high G, the F sharp, the E, D, C sharp, and B. Those are the 7 notes that you're going to cover within the tenor range. The high A is going to sit on a 14-inch tenor drum. Most of the time that's where the high A sits nicely. The high G and the F sharp both sit nicely on a 15-inch. The E sits nicely on a 16-inch. The D and the C sharp on an 18-inch, and the B on a 20-inch. And there are different drums that work on other sizes as well, so you can sometimes get away with having a high G sitting on a 14-inch if that's all you have available, or having the D sitting on a 16-inch if you don't have a second 18-inch available. Those can work quite nicely on those drums as well. When we're thinking about voicing the actual music, there's 2 ways to go about this. You can either be literal with your voicing. You can identify what note is playing at exactly the point where your tenor drummer is going to play and play that same note. Or you can think about the key of the full tune and the notes available within that key that you can play across that full tune. I use a mixture of both when I'm writing the bass section. One thing to bear in mind is not to be tempted to voice every single note that you've got in your rhythm. You want to have some space. You want to have a chance for the bass drum to come to the fore and not overpower everything by having every single note voiced across the bass section. So if you have, say, a run of time, what we call time, where the bass drum is just keeping time throughout the score, then you want to maybe not voice every single note within that time phrase. And just let the bass drum sit in the background. This can also act as a tempo check for the whole band. So the band, if there's sections where we maybe feel as if things are moving slightly and the cohesion of the band is kind of moving, these parts where the straight time is played in the bass drum can be good tempo checks for the full band. The first thing you need to do when you're sitting down is make sure you have the pipe score available to you. Make sure that you can see the pipe score, and you've obviously had the snare score to write your rhythm, and you've got everything there in front of you you're going to need to be able to voice this. Identify if the tune is a major or minor tune. That's very important. So what we mean by that is the style that it's written in. If it's major, it's going to sound quite happy and bright, and if it's minor, it's going to sound quite sad and dark. Okay? We have 4 keys that we use often within pipe music, or 4 prominent ones. They are A major, which is A, E, and C sharp, D major, which is D, F sharp, and A minor, which is A, E, and has D and G prominent, and the B minor, which is B, D, and G. Those notes are all the notes that are prominent within those keys of that tune. It doesn't mean that you can only use those notes. As I said before, you can use other notes if it lends itself to it within a phrase that you're playing or a pattern that you're playing. But these notes are the notes that are most prominent within those keys. The A minor is actually really easily identifiable by the lack of the C note. So if you hear a tune that doesn't have the C feature in it, but has the A and E feature in it, and maybe has more D and G, it's going to be your A minor. Okay. One thing to remember, and try not to let your players be precious about, is not playing a lot of notes. If you have a piece of music and you identify that the E drum is only playing 1 note or is not playing at all, that's absolutely fine, and try and portray that to your section as well. It's nothing personal. It just means that that note doesn't quite work within that tune, and it will work in other tunes within your set or within your whole repertoire. So just make sure that that is not something that comes to the fore and becomes an issue, okay? Try and think about what direction you want any phrases to progress in. So what I mean by that is if you have a phrase that has a few triplets in it, or picks out quite a few different rudimental phrases within the snare score in a pattern in a row, think about whether you want that to go up the scale, so from the low drum up to the high drum, or whether you want it to go in the opposite direction, high to low. That doesn't always need to be dictated by what direction the melody goes in. So if the melody goes, say, from high in the scale down to low notes in the scale, it can be quite nice to use the counterpoint at that time, which is going against that and going from the low notes on the tenor up to the high notes. That can work quite well. Think about these different things that can work and make add a different layer to the whole picture. Try and be sensible with your voicing. Make sure you're not asking your drummers to play some rhythm that's impossible or split rhythm impossible. If you have a triplet, for example, onto another note that you go strawberry jam or digga-da-da, make sure you're not asking your tenor drummers to play the first two notes on one drum and the next two notes on a different drum. As we know, when we play that phrase up tempo, it's not going to work. It's not going to come across cleanly, especially with the nature of the tenor drum that has resonance to when you play it. It's going to end up blending into the next note. So make sure that it makes sense, what you're asking them to do. In the case of a concert band, which the National Youth Pipe Band is, always try and listen to the backing band or know what the backing band are doing at a certain point. This is very important because there'll be sections where the backing band are maybe dropping out or are playing a phrase that is quite a lot going on, and you want to be able to reflect that within the bass section score as well. So yes, have the pipe score in mind, have the snare score in mind, but try and have the overall picture of the band in mind as well. And don't be afraid to stray from those constraints of the chordal progressions that we were talking about before. You can use different notes that maybe aren't prominent within that tune, but you want to hear coming out of a certain phrase. That's absolutely fine. So if you hear notes coming out that maybe don't work within that phrase or within that key, as we've covered before, that's okay as long as it does lend itself to it at that specific point. So the third element is the visual element. And as I said before, this is very individual and can be a stylistic element to whatever band you're writing for. So for that reason, there's not many things to cover in terms of direction here. You want to try and be quite individual and innovative with your visuals. There's a couple of things to think about that can work quite nicely, regardless of style. These can be the split flourish element. And what we mean by that is having sections of the core play or flourish at different times, or play the same flourish, but a kind of call and answer between, say, the sides of the tenor section, or individual players throughout the tenor section, say numbers 1, 3, and 5, if you number your tenor drummers, playing one flourish, and maybe the other drummers playing a different flourish at the same time. It can look quite nice. So you want to try and make sure that you're trying to be innovative that way as well. So with all that in mind, we're now going to show you an example of a drum score, the snare score and the tenor score played at the same time. And try and think about the things that we've covered with the rhythm, the voicing, and try and hear if you can hear all of that coming together and the progression of the bass section score as you go through the tune.